Thank you for joining us for today's Nutrition and Focus video vignette brought to you by Allergy Research Group. The topic of today's video vignette is integrative perspectives on ADHD, which we felt was of a timely nature as school is back in session full force and many children are still stuck at home doing online learning. My name is Carrie Decker, and I'm a naturopathic physician. A lot of my focus has always been mental and cognitive health, as well as chronic digestive disease. Each of these can be additional considerations when we encounter ADHD. Today, I will speak to the different factors we consider from an integrative perspective when working with someone struggling with ADHD. So as we get into our talk here, we'll first take a look at what is ADHD. What do we see medically when we encounter ADHD or make that type of diagnoses? Then we'll take a look at ADHD statistics in children and a little bit in adults. And then we'll take a look at the factors contributing to ADHD, both the commonly accepted medical factors as well as those that we look at from an integrative perspective. And then we'll take a look at different ways to support the child with ADHD from an integrative medicine aspect. So ADHD, the little images here show two different girls, and one, of course, is looking very intently, or well, I guess she's looking at the other girl playing with a pile of books. But the difference between children with ADHD and those without ADHD is that those with ADHD tend to have a high level of energy. We often see them finding more active things to do, and also they tend to lack a sustained focus on things, which can make learning difficult. But it also can be a problem for making friendships, other relationships in their lives, and even as adults, we can have problems with people with ADHD with maintaining jobs or staying focused on the things that they want to accomplish. Of course, it's something that we commonly see manifest in childhood initially, and it comes up usually in the mid grade school ages, because that's when you need to have a little bit more sustained focus. In kindergarten and things, children are able to do all sorts of creative projects where, even math is just a matter of counting and doing fun things with their hands, whereas in the later years, there's a lot more sustained focus on papers in front of them and the teacher. The hyperactivity can be present, but there also can be more of a daydreaming type of ADHD known as inattentive ADHD. As I mentioned, the symptoms not only affect academic performance, but they also affect social functioning. The prevalence varies, but in the overall, over a broad range of years, including children and adults, it's about 7.2% of the population that is affected by ADHD. In school-age children, we see it higher numbers, of course, between 9 and 15%, while adults, the prevalence is 4.4%. One of the factors that may be at play here is that as we move into adulthood, we come up with ways to deal with things that may be presented as difficulties when we were in school as children. As adults, a person who struggled with ADHD might have a more active job where they're outside in nature, are building and doing things with their hands, whereas in school, you all have to oftentimes do the very same things, and that's just not for everyone. The different things might also come into play in adults where there's just not reporting of things, there's use of other substances to modulate moods and attention, etc. ADHD is more common in boys than girls of the hyperactive type, so that's more the movement, impulsivity. We see the ratio being 4-to-1, favoring more males. And for the inattentive type, it's 2-to-1. So the more daydreaming kind of presentation you might see a little bit more often with girls as well. Parent-reported ADHD was increased from 2003 to 2011 from 42%. And right now in 2020, we are struggling with all sorts of new things on our plate here. And parents really are becoming more aware of the difficulties that their child might be having in school, because there are a lot more parents that are forced to be in this role where they're doing the education. Parents are caregivers, I should say. So I, would really anticipate a jump in the numbers in the upcoming next, larger assessment of population in the next 5 years. And as I mentioned, there's other things that come into play in the comorbid types of things we can see oftentimes with ADHD are different mood issues like anxiety and depression, as well as conduct disorders, so behavioral things coming up, and the learning disorders and disabilities. We also have problems with sleeping being also that are common in with ADHD, and we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically and how it might play into the problems of mood as well as attention. And in adults, as I mentioned, substance use can be a little bit more at play, as adults are a lot more, have things accessible to them and can use other things to modulate their mood and attention, I should say. An age factor, there's a couple different things with age that come up, as I mentioned, as when someone's in children, a very small, younger child and in kindergarten, they have a lot more active activities that they can partake in their classroom. They do projects a lot more than you do when you're in, say, third grade. So it might be just, a child might be just seen as being enthusiastic when you go to the teacher reviews of their performance during the year, whereas in an older age, it would be seen as problematic. But another factor with age is particularly interesting to note. A Canadian study that was done, and there also are studies in other populations, but in this study, it showed that the youngest boys and girls in their class were much more likely to be diagnosed with a prescribed medication specifically for ADHD. So this Canadian study is one of interest to note, although there was studies done in other populations, not just in Canada, looking at the same type of thing, but it was shown that the youngest children in their classes, the boys or girls, were more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or prescribed a medication. One of the things, is here is that when you're young, a 5-year-old versus almost 6-year-old really will have a different capacity for doing things requiring concentration and focus, and even their mental aptitude is far different when you're just a year older, and it's basically a third, or not a third, but it's a larger percentage relatively speaking. So when children are the younger child in the grade, that kind of behavior and problem might be sustained through the next years. Kind of you get used to being the one needing more attention. You get used to the one being who doesn't get the problem being explained. So it might just play into ongoing problems when you're the youngest child. Lots of accepted contributing factors from a medical perspective. So we have, numerous neurotransmitters, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Excitatory neurotransmitters kind of turn things on, the circuitry, turn on the firing of neurons, and inhibitory neurons and neurotransmitters, I should say, dampen things down. So we really need a balance of excitatory and inhibitory to be, cognitively functioning, awake, and alert. All of those things can be affected by both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Dopamine is a particular one that comes into play with ADHD. The medication methylphenidate blocks dopamine reuptake. So basically what happens is there's potentially inadequate amounts of dopamine in the synapses where we need it to do its active function. What has been shown is there's an excess of dopamine transporters, which means the neurons take it up faster than it should be, leading to what's kind of known as a functional deficiency. Higher levels of the norepinephrine, which is excitatory primarily, also have been shown. So there's just this imbalance in inhibitory, excitatory neurotransmitters. Dopamine in particular plays a role, though, in attention, motivation, learning behaviors, etc. Other factors, have been shown to be differences in brain anatomy on imaging, such as MRIs, also different activation or altered activation in different regions of the brain in children with ADHD compared to non-ADHD populations. And both of these factors can play a role in the altered functioning of executive function, like decision making, abstract reasoning, so like solving of complex math problems, like story problems, mental flexibility, and working memory. There's also a high level of genetic heritability, which can be discouraging, right? Because, if you suffer from ADHD, do you really want to be struggling with a child that has ADHD after knowing what you struggled with? But what is really important to consider is that genetics are not exactly what we see come out all the time. So just because you have a genotype, which is the genome, the code that we have, it doesn't mean that that's the phenotype or what presents. Things like epigenetics, different epigenetic factors like diet and lifestyle, nutritional deficiencies, are adequate amounts of nutrients, environmental toxicants, different things can affect the phenotype that we present. So there's always things you can do to support the healthier mental capacity and reduce behaviors of ADHD from a nutritional perspective. But then we really look at, more other things that can contribute from an integrative perspective. And, these are actually things that are, I think the majority of them are also listed and up to date. So physicians that are just a standard traditional MD would be aware of these things, but they would likely not be in a position where they have, time to deal with it in a busy clinical practice. So integrative practitioners often are the ones that are more taking a look at these things. But dietary deficiencies, so vitamin D, zinc, iodine being some of them, we'll have a whole nother a little vignette about the nutritional factors contributing. Insufficient sleep, we'll talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide, but anytime that I have inadequate sleep, particularly for numerous days in a row, I know my mental ability as well as my emotional health feels like it takes a toll. It all takes a toll on those things. A lot of different dietary contributors. So we take a look, of course, at sugars in the diets. Even children that aren't diagnosed with ADHD, parents are well aware that really sugary things before bedtime might not be a good idea because everyone gets a little bit amped when they have more sugar. Food additives, food sensitivities, allergies, and intolerances are the larger group of things that integrative perspective, from an integrative perspective, we often take a look at as well. Food additives being things like food colorings that are not natural to the body or not naturally found in food, flavorings, etc. And then the sensitivities, allergies, intolerances, there's different things, lactose intolerance, that's an intolerance for lactose. So an enzyme or something can improve one's tolerance to lactose. Allergies are more the official or considered official allergies. So a histamine response, IgE, antibodies. And then food sensitivities being something where it's a walk in the gray area. From a non-integrative perspective, oftentimes food sensitivities are neglected or sort of pushed aside. But from integrative practitioners tend to believe that they can be a contributing factor. And myself, I've seen that reduction of things that one has a sensitivity to can be helpful because it reduces inflammation in the body. So then, of course, each of these things can play into the inflammation and oxidative stress. Inflammation and oxidative stress, well, they come back and they affect our phenotype. Besides the fact that they also contribute to further imbalances in neurotransmitters and stress and taxing inflammation in the brain. And then another factor, of course, can be prenatal medication use, prenatal nutritional deficiencies like iodine, as well as exposure to things like tobacco smoke or alcohol. So nutritional deficiencies, as I mentioned, we'll talk about it in a further video vignette, but they really play a factor in so many disease conditions, and that's why we take a look at them from the first thing, because anytime there's a nutritional deficiency like vitamin D, it can be a factor in not only ADHD, but it can play a role in mood disorders, allergies, and asthma, as well as an increased susceptibility to infections. Things like zinc also play a role in numerous conditions, vitamin C being not just an essential vitamin, but also an antioxidant in our body. That is why, from an integrative perspective, we take a look at dietary deficiencies first, because they can contribute to all sorts of conditions. And each of these conditions that have been, shown on this little figure here, all are increasing in children. So when we see that, we really need to take a look at what we're getting for nutrients in our diet as well as our children's. Common pediatric deficiencies, and this is population-wide, not just children with ADHD. This includes, populations like the U.S. where we think we have all this abundance, but iron is very common. So iron, of course, leads to anemia. A couple of the B vitamins, vitamin B6 and folate. Vitamin D, which, as I mentioned, plays a role in so many conditions that we have increased concern of. Vitamin E, which also is important for healthy immune function. Iodine, which is important for our thyroid function, but without adequate thyroid function, we can have cognitive problems or problems with cognitive development, brain development, as well as zinc. And then other things that are underconsumed are vitamins A and C, which of course are also very important for healthy immune function, as well as calcium and magnesium, which, we're very familiar with. Calcium and magnesium is important for growth and healthy bones. sleep and ADHD. So there's some interesting studies here. As you know, as I mentioned, of course, we're all aware that when we lack on sleep, we can all feel a little bit off, particularly if it's over a prolonged period. But children with ADHD, particularly the adolescents, have been shown to have a really high use of media after 9 p.m. So the study here actually found 5 hours of media use on average in children after 9 p.m. Like, that's easily, 2 in the morning, and anyone staying up till 2 in the morning is probably going to have a problem getting up when they have to get up for school the next day at, say, 7 a.m. That's 5 hours of sleep, and it might not even be good sleep because the blue light really affects our ability to enter that deep REM sleep. And when you only have 5 hours to begin with, you're really not going to have much time to get to that deep REM part of the sleep cycle. In the media use, the increased media use, the higher it was associated with increased anxiety and depressive symptoms, which we already know to coexist oftentimes with ADHD. A 2020 study, so this was before we're stuck in the current sort of COVID pandemic era, but nonetheless, there still has been people looking at data as we always do. And this one showed in a general community, which did include a small subset of individuals with ADHD. I think roughly 10% had been diagnosed with it, but it looked at the larger population. It was shown that at the increased media time and the sleep deprivation were correlated with ADHD type symptoms. And that was not just in the population with ADHD, it was ADHD type symptoms in the whole population. And another factor that medical practitioners might not bring up is the methylphenidate commonly has a side effect of insomnia. So it's not a cure for the condition, it's a palliative for the symptoms of attention, but it doesn't fix the problem by any means. Other things with this excitatory inhibitory neurotransmitter balance that we take a look at is what are the other excitatory neurotransmitters that may be contributing. And one, of course, being glutamate and GABA. We talk about the imbalance of them with all sorts of conditions as factors leading to neuroinflammation. But glutamate, individuals with ADHD may have genetic difficulty breaking down glutamate. An enzyme known as glutamic acid decarboxylase, which actually has B6 as a cofactor, which we know to be often a deficiency in children population-wide, might not be that enzyme GAD, glutamic acid decarboxylase, may not be effectively breaking down glutamate, so one might be genetically predisposed to have this imbalance in glutamate and GABA. Other excitatory neurotransmitters, one that shows up top on the list there is histamine. And histamine, of course, as I mentioned, is associated with allergies. So if we're addressing allergies and decreasing the overall levels of histamine in the body, we can reduce the levels of it as function as an excitatory neurotransmitter as well. And these imbalances, of course, in excitatory inhibitory neurotransmitters further contribute to the inflammation, oxidative stress, and further dysfunction. So when we look at things from an integrative perspective, the first thing to do is to address the basis of some of the problem, from a non-supplement perspective, of course, fixing the sleep problem, getting the electronics out of the bedroom, putting a blue light filter on things, on electronics after 6 p.m., really improving things that can contribute to sleep. Not having stressful conversations at the dinner table, not, like doing different things to keep things happy and relaxing for children in the evening time. Then looking at dietary refinement, I'm a firm believer that one needs to put more of the healthy things in the diet, in addition to reducing the problematic things. And oftentimes people do better adding healthy things than they do reducing unhealthy things. So increasing colorful fruits and vegetables, and then working on the decrease of sugars, added sugars. The gluten can be a factor. It's inflammatory for many people, processed foods, as well as the food additives and colorings. And then when we want to take a further look at things, one might take a look at the food sensitivities with a blood test of some sorts to look at what other factors might be contributing to inflammation. But usually it's beneficial for most people to do these other things on the first level, the sugars, the food additives and colorings and processed foods. Speaking from a clinical perspective, I've often seen parents do these dietary things and they definitely can tell their child is improving. And when they really know that things have worked is when the child goes off to a birthday party and has some big dose of sugar and food coloring and all of these things at once. And then they're like, my child was bouncing off the wall for days after that. So it really becomes apparent even more after, a re-exposure to some of these things that were the triggers. Additional things that one might work with under the support of an integrative provider are things like a pediatric multivitamin and mineral. And, oftentimes you can find one of these that has been developed for children and that thus they should have the appropriate amounts of the nutrients for them. But nonetheless, it is helpful to be working with a provider with even a multivitamin mineral as a nutrient deficiency should be assessed for certain things, particularly vitamin D and ferritin, because of the role that they can play. Essential fatty acids are important, increasing the intake of fatty fish. Not everyone might like fatty fish, but there are tasty versions of fish oils out there to be supplemented. And magnesium is generally also something that can be very helpful. It helps to turn the circuits down. It helps to be us to relax, helps us to improve our parasympathetic tone, or relax and digest part of our nervous system balance. And it also supports sleep. Just to be cautious with magnesium, it can be something that has a bit of a laxative effect. So just adding it a small amount in a very gradual fashion. So wonderful to be able to give this background to y'all. And we're going to have another little video vignette on the topic of the nutritional deficiencies, most specifically talking about some of them that were discussed today, but a lot in greater depth with the studies that have been shown. Thank you for joining this. Glad you could join us today for this nutritional focus video vignette. Of course, additional reading on this and countless other topics can be found in our more than 100 educational blog posts found on the Nutrition and Focus blog on the Allergy Research Group website, or by typing in the link shown here. Till next time.